hall had always been known as a quiet place, the kind of room where every footstep echoed and every whispered word floated in the air a little longer than it should. On the afternoon of the showcase, sunlight spilled through the tall windows and stretched across the old wooden floor. The chairs had been lined up neatly by volunteers, and a faint scent of polish and paper programs drifted through the space. People entered in small groups, finding their seats and speaking in soft voices as the event slowly inched closer to beginning. A visiting teacher from the United States walked in with a confident stride, her heels tapping sharply on the floor. She carried a folder tucked tightly under her arm and wore an expression that suggested she had seen more students than she could possibly remember. She had been invited as a special guest, someone who could offer guidance to the young performers, and if things went well, maybe discover a rising talent. But as she looked around the modest hall, she seemed more interested in finishing her assignment quickly and returning to her hotel. She found her seat in the front row and settled down, crossing one leg over the other. Her eyes moved from the piano to the students waiting near the side of the stage. Most were older teens dressed in neat clothes, their hair carefully brushed, their sheet music held close to their chests. The teacher gave them a polite glance, then returned to reading the notes she had been given about the event. A few more minutes passed. People continued to trickle in, filling the hall until a soft hum of conversation grew in the background. A volunteer made a brief announcement, asking everyone to silence their phones and prepare for the first performer. The teacher placed her folder on her lap and straightened her posture, preparing herself for what she assumed would be a long line of average performances. Then the young piano player stepped forward. The teacher noticed them only because the room grew a little quieter. The rest of the performers stood together in their tidy outfits, but this kid looked different. Their clothes were plain and slightly worn. Their sleeves hung a little long, and the shoes they wore had clear signs of use. They held no sheet music in their hands and kept their eyes fixed on the floor as they walked toward the piano. The teacher raised an eyebrow. She had spent years working with young musicians, and she believed she could tell a lot from simple details. The way someone walked, the way they held their hands, even the way they sat down at an instrument. These things usually said more than the first note ever did. As the young player moved across the stage, she saw no confidence, no sharpness, none of the usual signals she associated with strong performers. She let out a small sigh and shifted in her chair, lowering her expectations almost instantly. She picked up her pen, clicked it, and wrote something on the top corner of the evaluation sheet. Even before a single note had been played, the kid approached the piano slowly, almost cautiously. They paused for a moment behind the bench, as if unsure whether the seat truly belonged to them. After a short breath, they sat down. Their feet barely reached the pedals comfortably. Their hands hovered above the keys, but didn't touch them yet. The teacher watched all of this with the kind of detached interest someone has when they already think they know how a story ends. She had seen countless young students freeze in front of an audience. She had watched many of them crumble under pressure. In her mind, this kid was about to become another quiet example of nerves and inexperience. The hall, already silent, seemed to hold its breath. People shifted in their chairs, waiting for the performance to begin. Some parents leaned forward with gentle smiles, hoping to offer reassurance from afar. A younger child somewhere in the back whispered a question and was quickly hushed. The young pianist swallowed hard. Their shoulders tensed, then relaxed just slightly. With trembling fingers, they touched the keys for the first time. The opening notes fell into the room with hesitation. They were soft, almost uncertain, and a few were pressed just a little too late. The melody wobbled like someone trying to keep their balance on a narrow path. There was an almost fragile feeling to the music, as if the performer was unsure whether they deserved to be heard. The teacher exhaled slowly and shook her head the tiniest bit. She wrote something else on her paper, her pen scratching quietly in the silence. She didn't do it to be cruel. To her, this was simply the reality of judging. She had been brought here to evaluate honestly, to point out weaknesses so students could improve. But she also believed she had enough experience to spot talent early. To her, the first moments of a performance were usually just as telling as the last. She looked up again at the young player. Their shoulders were curled in, their heads slightly lowered. It looked as though every note cost them effort just to keep going. The teacher couldn't help but feel a small wave of impatience. She knew the showcase had many participants, and a slow beginning meant a longer afternoon. Still, she listened because that was her job. The mistakes continued. The rhythm drifted out of place, and the melody struggled to find steady ground. A couple of people in the audience exchanged sympathetic glances. They weren't judging harshly, but the tension was clear. Everyone could sense the performer's nerves. The teacher tapped her pen against her knee and glanced briefly at the clock on the wall. Only a minute or so had passed, though it felt longer. She crossed out something she had written and replaced it with another short note. The young player's hands moved awkwardly, searching for the next notes. The music faltered again, and the teacher pressed her lips together. She'd seen this before, too many times to count. A kid with limited training, little confidence, probably not much support at home. Someone who practiced when they could, but rarely had the chance to play in front of others. She didn't blame them, but she also didn't expect anything more. A soft cough came from somewhere in the crowd. The performer flinched at the sound, and the melody collapsed entirely for a moment. They froze, staring at the keys as if they no longer remembered what they were supposed to do. The teacher leaned back in her seat, letting her clipboard rest against her knee. At that moment, she felt certain the performance was already decided. Some students simply weren't ready, and this seemed like one of those times. But the kid didn't get up. They didn't run off the stage or ask to start over. Instead, they closed their eyes for the briefest second. Their shoulders rose on a slow inhale, then dropped with a shaky exhale. The hall remained silent. No one moved. No one whispered dot. The kid opened their eyes again. Something about their expression had changed, though the teacher couldn't quite tell what it was. The performer set their hands back on the keys, fingers still trembling, but positioned with more care. The teacher watched closely, expecting another scattered note, another timid reach for the melody. But before the next sound came, she thought she noticed something new, a slight shift in the player's posture, barely noticeable, but enough to make her hesitate. The kid straightened just a little, as though remembering something important. The teacher wasn't sure what it meant. Maybe it was just an attempt to gather courage. Maybe the performer had finally accepted that the only way forward was to keep playing. Whatever the reason, the teacher's pen finally stopped moving. She paused her notes and waited. That moment, quiet and small as it was, would mark the beginning of a change she never expected. As the performer prepared to play again, the teacher settled into her seat, unaware that her assumptions, so certain just moments before, about to be challenged in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. The hall stayed silent for a long breath, as if the whole room was waiting to see what the young pianist would do next. The kid's hands hovered above the keys, not quite touching them, fingers curling and uncurling with nervous energy. It was clear they were fighting with themselves, fighting fear, fighting doubt, fighting the pressure of being watched by so many eyes. The American teacher kept her pen still now. Even though she still believed the performance was off to a weak start, there was something in the air that made her pause. Maybe it was the stillness in the hall, or the way the kid's breathing slowed. Maybe it was simply curiosity, a small pull inside her urging her to pay attention a bit longer. The kid finally pressed the keys again. The first few notes came out shaky all over again, uneven and full of hesitation. They didn't form a clear pattern at first. It almost sounded like the performer was trying to remember the melody as they went along, searching for the right path in a fog of nerves. A few murmurs swept through the back of the hall, soft and quickly silenced. The kids' shoulders stiffened. Their fingers slipped on one of the keys, producing a sound that made a few people wince quietly. The performer's breathing hitched, and for a moment, it seemed like everything was about to collapse again. The teacher scratched something small on her evaluation sheet, but she didn't look away. Her expression wasn't cruel. It was simply the face of someone who believed she had seen this outcome many times. A shaky student, too nervous to perform well. Another young musician, overwhelmed by the moment, but the kid didn't pull their hands back. Instead, they carefully restarted a phrase, trying again, even if their hands trembled with each movement. The people seated in the first few rows leaned forward a little. They could see the way the young pianist's fingers pressed too softly on the keys, the way their foot hovered above the pedal without daring to commit. It was the kind of moment that made your heart squeeze just watching it. A deep breath from the performer shook slightly, but it was enough to reset something inside them. Then, slowly, something changed. The kids' hands began to settle into a rhythm, not perfect, not confident, but steadier than before. The melody took shape, even though it trembled under every note. It was like watching someone find their footing after slipping on ice. Each key sounded like a step toward control. The teacher noticed the shift. It wasn't dramatic or sudden enough to impress her yet, but she did stop tapping her pen. Her gaze sharpened just slightly as she studied the performer more closely. The kid adjusted their posture without even realizing it. Their backs straightened and their shoulders dropped as they settled into the music. Their eyes focused more on the keys rather than the audience. Slowly, the expression of fear on their face softened into an expression of concentration. The hall responded to the change with a different kind of silence, one filled with anticipation rather than discomfort. The piano's sound began to stretch into the room more clearly now. The notes blended together, forming recognizable patterns, even if they still wavered on occasion. The performers seemed to be reminding themselves why they loved playing, why they had stepped onto the stage despite everything. For the first time since sitting down, their fingers moved with a hint of flow. The teacher crossed her arms lightly, watching. She had been around enough students to know that sometimes even the timid ones had moments where the music gave them strength. But she wasn't convinced yet. She thought the improvement might just be a brief burst of adrenaline, something that could disappear as quickly as it came. Still, she listened. The kid played on, piece by piece, building the melody with growing steadiness. Their breathing matched the rhythm now, rising and falling with the music. The mistakes were fewer, though still present. A few notes slipped, but the kid kept going without freezing this time. It felt like a small victory with each brave attempt at continuing. Soft rustling came from the audience as people shifted in their seats, sensing that something was different. Some parents exchanged glances, their expressions warming. A few of the older teens, watching from the side of the stage, straightened, their competitive guard lowering into genuine interest. The teacher observed all of this quietly. She knew the audience's mood could influence a performer strongly. A supportive room could sometimes lift a student out of fear, but she still didn't expect much more than an average performance. Her attention, however, never left the kid. The performer paused briefly during a transition. Their hands hovered over the next chord, unsure. Their breath caught in their throat. Another wave of nerves crept up their spine. The teacher could see it happen, a slight tremor in the shoulders, the quick glance toward the crowd, the tiny swallow of fear. But then the kid closed their eyes for a second. The moment stretched out. Silent and vulnerable Dot, when they opened their eyes again, something in their face had shifted. It wasn't confidence, not yet. But there was a spark of determination, a sense that they had decided to push, even if they stumbled Dot, and so they continued. The next set of notes landed more firmly, gathering strength. The performer's fingers pressed the keys with new intention, no longer as afraid of making mistakes. A subtle energy began to move through their hands, changing the sound that filled the hall. The teacher felt a small flicker of surprise. She sat up slightly, a tiny movement that went unnoticed by most of the audience. Her eyes narrowed a little, not in judgment, but in curiosity she wasn't ready to admit. Who was this kid? And why did their playing suddenly feel different? The melody, still soft, flowed into a smoother sequence. It was like listening to a story that had started with stumbles and whispers, but was now gaining enough strength to speak clearly. The performer's fingers glided more confidently from one note to the next. The tension in their body eased bit by bit. The teacher placed her pen down completely. A soft warmth grew in the room. The music wasn't loud or powerful yet, but it carried an emotion so honest that it slowly pulled the audience in. There was something fragile yet beautiful about the way the kid played, something gentle and real. The performer's breathing became steady. Their shoulders settled into the rhythm. Their backs straightened a little more. The earlier mistakes now felt like distant memories. Still, the teacher kept a careful eye. She wasn't easy to impress. She had heard incredible performers, students who played with technique, so precise it felt like watching magic. She didn't sense that kind of skill here. But she felt something else, something raw and stubborn. The determination of someone who refused to give up. The kid hit a more difficult part of the piece, and the notes faltered again. Their fingers hesitated. A brief twist of panic crossed their face. But then, almost immediately, they caught themselves and continued. Even if the notes were imperfect. It was that moment that caught the teacher's attention most. She leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on her knees. She watched the kid power through the tough section, refusing to stop, refusing to break. Imperfection didn't scare them anymore, not the way it had minutes earlier. The audience sensed the shift too. A few people nodded softly to themselves. Someone in the back whispered something encouraging. The atmosphere in the hall had changed from tense to supportive. The teacher had seen many students crumble, but only a few climbed upward during a performance. And this kid, despite the shaky start, was climbing. The performer entered the next phrase. Their hands moved more fluidly, no longer flinching with every note. The melody grew stronger and steadier, filling the room with a quiet beauty. The kid's face softened. Their brows relaxed. Their breathing synced perfectly with the rhythm again. And the music, soft but honest, spread through the hall like a warm wave. The teacher didn't smile, but her expression changed just enough to show that she was now paying full attention. She no longer looked bored or impatient. She was studying, evaluating not just technique, but heart. The performer had something she hadn't expected. She didn't know yet what that something was, but she could feel it growing. The kid reached the final line of this section of the piece. Their hands slowed, letting the last few notes fall gently into the air. When the sound faded, there was no applause. Yet it wasn't the end of the performance. But there was something else. A sense that the story was shifting. Sense that something surprising was building. Beneath the surface, the teacher felt a small, odd flutter in her chest. A question she hadn't asked in a long time crossed her mind. Could this kid actually be more than they seemed? The kid placed their hands back on the keys, ready to continue. And in that quiet moment, before the next note sounded, the teacher leaned in ever so slightly, not out of duty, but out of genuine interest. She didn't know it yet, but her assumptions were about to be challenged far more than she expected. The air inside the hall seemed to change as the young pianist prepared to continue. The audience had felt the shift already, even if they didn't fully understand it. What had started as a shaky, uncertain performance was now beginning to form into something more solid, something that hinted at a story behind the music. People leaned in almost unconsciously, their eyes fixed on the small figure seated at the piano. The kid drew in a slow breath. Their hands rested on the keys, not trembling as much as before. The nerves were still there, but they weren't ruling over every movement anymore. They were simply sitting in the background, quieter and easier to handle. Then, with a careful motion, the kid began the next part of the piece. This time, the notes didn't scatter. They didn't collapse into hesitation or fear. Instead, they rolled out with a calm confidence that surprised many who listened. It wasn't loud or showy. It was controlled, steady, and full of emotion that felt real. The teacher's head lifted just a bit higher. Her eyebrows formed a faint line as she focused more closely on the performer. She wasn't leaning back in boredom anymore. She was examining everything: the rhythm, the tone, the way the kid shaped the melody. Something was happening here. Something she hadn't expected when the performance first began. The kid settled into the rhythm as if finally recognizing a familiar path. The music grew warmer, fuller, and more expressive. Their fingers moved with purpose now, even during the more delicate passages. The hall seemed to melt into the background as the performer focused on the keys. Each note landed with intention, not by accident. The teacher felt a small jolt of interest when the kid executed a clean transition that she was almost certain would trip them up. It wasn't perfect, but it was far better than what she had predicted. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, watching closely. She still didn't smile. She wasn't the type to show delight easily, but her attention, sharp and unblinking now, revealed more than any facial expression could. She was engaged. The kid played on, their breathing steady, their focus strong. The melody rose and fell like a quiet wave, each phrase building on the last. And with every passing moment, the performer seemed to discover new confidence in their own hands. The audience began to feel it too. A soft energy spread through the room, not loud or disruptive, but warm and growing. People who had felt uncomfortable at the start now relaxed. Their shoulders dropped, their expression softened. They were listening not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity. The kid played with a sense of honesty that touched something in the room. There was no showmanship, no attempt at impressing anyone through dramatic gestures or exaggerated movements. Instead, it felt like the performer was speaking through the music in the only way they knew how. The teacher recognized this feeling. She had seen true emotion in playing before, not often, but enough to know when it was real. And what she was hearing now wasn't polished or perfect, but it was sincere. As the performer reached a more expressive part of the piece, their hands moved more boldly. The sound grew richer, filling the hall with warmth. The notes connected smoothly, forming a gentle but striking flow that captured the audience's attention completely. A few people in the crowd exchanged impressed glances. Some whispered quietly to each other, though their whispers faded fast, careful not to break the moment. The teacher watched the kid's face. She noticed the way their expression softened, the way their eyes focused with a calm determination. The performer had shifted from fear to something else, something deeper. A sense of belonging. As the music carried on, it was clear that the kid wasn't just playing from memory. They were playing from emotion, from personal experience. Every rise and fall of the melody seemed to echo something inside them. The hall, though full of people, felt almost intimate now, like the performer and the piano were the only things that truly existed in that moment. The teacher found herself thinking of her own students back home, all the ones she had trained, coached, pushed, and corrected. She knew talent came in different forms. Some had perfect technique, some had sharp intuition, some had discipline, but very few had a natural emotional connection to the music. She wasn't ready to say this kid had it, not yet. But the possibility had grown from a small flicker to a steady flame. The kid hit a more challenging section of the piece. The teacher held her breath without meaning to. Her fingers, resting on her knee, curled inward as she watched the performer attempt the more delicate run of notes. The kid hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. A small stumble almost pushed them out of rhythm. The audience sensed the tension. But then the performer steadied their hands and pushed through the difficulty, the notes landing with surprising clarity. Their fingers glided across the keys, recovering quickly. The teacher blinked, her expression shifting for the first time. She hadn't expected that recovery. It required not only skill, but also presence of mind, something many young players struggled with. Few people in the audience let out soft breaths of relief. Someone near the front nodded gently, impressed. The kid continued, building momentum with every phrase. Their confidence wasn't loud or showy, but it grew with each measure, spreading through the music like light filling a room. Even the performers sensed the shift. Their shoulders no longer curled inward. Their face no longer tightened with fear. Instead, there was calm focus and inner world only they could feel. The teacher found herself unable to look away now. She noticed the little things, the way the performer's fingers lifted with care, the way their foot pressed the pedal with thoughtfulness, the way their timing, though not perfect, held a natural flow. The music had a heartbeat, a pulse that came instinctively rather than from strict training. The kid reached another emotional moment in the piece, and the notes softened. The melody dipped downward in a tender curve, filled with quiet longing. The hall shifted again, turning from curiosity to gentle admiration. Some people felt a lump in their throat. Others simply closed their eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over them. The teacher felt something too, a tug she hadn't felt in a long time. It was the sense of witnessing a performer who didn't just memorize music, but lived inside it. She tried to keep her expression neutral. She reminded herself that the kids still lacked technical polish, that their start was messy, that they had made mistakes. But those thoughts faded when the kid played the next delicate line, each note placed with such softness that it felt like a whisper. The teacher's heart, despite her disciplined reserve, softened just a little. The kid continued, moving into a rising sequence that required both control and emotion. Their hands danced lightly but intentionally, and the melody responded, growing brighter and stronger. There was no tension anymore, no fear, just music. The audience was silent, but not in the same way as before. This silence was the kind that came from being moved, not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of being absorbed. The teacher held her breath again as the kid approached the climax of the section. It was the point where the melody swelled, gathering strength and emotion before opening into its final arc. The performer's fingers pressed firmly, bringing out the emotion of the piece with surprising maturity. The sound filled the hall, warm and rich, pulling at the hearts of the people listening. The teacher felt her chest tighten slightly, not from stress, but from something else, something she hadn't expected. Narration. The piece reached its final notes for this part of the performance. The kid slowed down, letting the last tones drift through the air like falling feathers. The sound lingered, soft and delicate, until it finally faded. A long, deep silence settled over the hall. The audience didn't move. They seemed unsure whether to breathe yet. The kid kept their hands hovering above the keys, as though afraid to break the moment too soon. Their eyes stayed on the piano, their expression calm but full of emotion. The teacher stared, stunned in a quiet, private way. She didn't show big reactions. That wasn't who she was. But inside, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel when the performance began. Respect. because this kid, this nervous, trembling, unsure young pianist, had just played with more heart than many polished students she had heard over the years. The silence finally broke when the kid prepared to move into the next portion of the piece. Their fingers returned to the key's dot, and for the first time since the performance began, the teacher leaned in, not out of duty, not out of courtesy, but out of genuine anticipation. She was ready to listen, really listen. The days leading up to the concert seemed to stretch and shrink at the same time. Everyone around the young player felt the pressure in different ways. His mother tried to hide her nerves by keeping herself busy around the house, but even she couldn't stop glancing at the clock every few minutes. His father, quiet as always, simply placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder every time he passed by, as if reminding him that no matter how things turned out, he was proud. But the young player himself felt something very different than fear. It wasn't confidence exactly, but something close to it. It came from the way he felt whenever he sat at the piano. No matter how loud the world became, the sound of the keys always calmed him. Every time his fingers touched them, he felt like he was returning to a place that belonged to him and him alone. Still, there was one thing that stayed heavy in his mind: the American teacher's reaction the first time he heard him play. That raised brow, that disappointed shake of the head, that quiet sigh that carried so much judgment. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him that way, but something about that moment stuck with him. Maybe because he had expected someone like that, a professional, someone respected, to understand him, even just a little. Instead, the man had dismissed him before even seeing who he really was. As the concert day approached, the young player spent more time than usual practicing, not to prove anything to the teacher, but because he wanted his music to feel the way it always did inside him. He didn't want the audience to simply hear notes. He wanted them to feel the story he was trying to tell. For him, the piano was more than an instrument. It was a voice, maybe the clearest one he had. The night before the concert, the hall held a short rehearsal. Students walked in and out, carrying folders of sheet music and wearing expressions that showed how hard they were trying to stay calm. The young player waited patiently near the backstage area until his name was called. He stepped onto the stage quietly, not trying to draw attention. Most of the teachers, volunteers, and other students didn't look up when he entered. They were tired and focused on their own responsibilities. But one person did notice: the American teacher, sitting in the third row with his arms crossed. His expression didn't change when he saw the young player walk in. If anything, it deepened into a look that suggested he was already preparing to be disappointed again. The rehearsal coordinator nodded for him to begin. The hall was almost empty. Just the staff and a handful of students waiting for their turn. The young player sat down at the polished piano bench, adjusting it slightly. He placed his hands on the keys and took a breath. Then he began to play. There were no dramatic movements, no exaggerated expressions. His body stayed still, but the music carried everything he didn't show. A quiet sadness at first, then a small spark of hope. Rising warmth, followed by the gentle weight of longing. The empty hall seemed to swell with sound. Even the soft echoes felt meaningful. For a moment, everyone in the room turned toward him, not because they were told to, but because something in the music pulled their attention. Even the American teacher, though he tried to hide it, leaned forward just a little. When the piece ended, the hall returned to silence. Not the silent judgment the young player had felt days earlier, but a kind that held respect. A few people near the stage clapped lightly, unsure if they were supposed to applaud during rehearsal. But feeling they couldn't stay quiet, the young player stood, thanked them, and stepped off the stage without looking at the teacher. He didn't need validation. Not then. But the teacher did speak to someone sitting next to him. "He's better than I thought," the man said softly, almost reluctantly. Much better. It wasn't praise, not fully, but it wasn't the dismissal from before. And though the young player didn't hear those words, the shift in the teacher's tone marked a small but important change. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the windows of the concert hall lobby. People arrived wearing their best clothes, excited to see the performances. Some carried flowers, others held small cameras, ready to capture moments they believed would matter. Backstage, the atmosphere buzzed. Students whispered their pieces to themselves, tapped rhythms on their legs, and tried not to show how nervous they were. The young player sat off to the side, not speaking, but observing. He noticed how one student's hands shook, how another took deep breaths over and over, how someone else kept a lucky charm hidden in their pocket. He didn't have a charm or a routine. He simply waited. The American teacher moved between students, offering short comments. Keep your tempo steady. Relax your shoulders. Don't rush the ending. But when he passed by the young player, he paused. You'll go on shortly, he said. The young player nodded. The teacher hesitated, then added, play it the way you did last night. It was as close to encouragement as the man could manage. But it meant more than he realized. Soon, the young player's name was announced. He stepped onto the stage, the bright lights warming his face. The hall was filled now, every seat taken, every whisper stopped. He walked to the piano and sat down. For a moment, he looked at the keys. They were the same keys he had touched thousands of times, yet every time felt new. Then he began. The room disappeared for him. The crowd, the lights, the expectations, they all faded as the music took over. It flowed effortlessly, each note shaped with care. He played louder when the story demanded strength, softer when it called for tenderness. His fingers danced across the keys with a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in days. As the music swelled, something changed in the audience. People leaned in. A child in the front row stopped fidgeting. A couple exchanged a quick glance, surprised by the feeling the music stirred in them. Even the volunteers at the back forgot the work still ahead of them. And in the third row, the American teacher slowly lowered his arms from his chest. He listened. Not as a critic, not as someone waiting for mistakes, but as someone who wanted to understand. He realized then that he had been wrong. The boy wasn't lacking skill. He simply expressed it in a way that didn't fit the teacher's expectations. The young player didn't play to impress. He played to speak. When the final note lingered in the air, the hall stayed quiet for one full breath. Then another. And then the applause came. It started softly, then grew until the entire hall burst into sound. People stood. Some even cheered. The young player remained still for a moment, overwhelmed. Then he rose and bowed gently. From his seat, the American teacher felt something shift inside him, something like respect, but mixed with regret, because while the hall erupted in excitement, he realized the boy's music had shown him something he hadn't expected at all. A reminder that talent doesn't always look the way you expect it to, but it speaks clearly to those willing to listen. The applause still echoed in the young player's ears long after he stepped off the stage. Even backstage, where everything usually felt cold and hurried, there was a warmth in the air. Students whispered excitedly. Volunteers moved with brighter expressions, and a few people even approached him with quiet words of praise. But he didn't cling to any of it. He simply nodded, thanked them softly, and stayed close to the curtain, listening to the next performer. His heart was still steady, not racing the way he expected. He wasn't shaking, he wasn't anxious, and he wasn't overwhelmed. Instead, he felt strangely calm, as if the music inside him had finally settled after days of noise and tension. The American teacher stood in the hallway nearby. He kept glancing in the young player's direction, but he didn't approach. Not yet. The performance had stirred something in him, but he didn't know how to express it. He wasn't used to being wrong, not publicly, not privately, and certainly not so completely. Yet here he was, replaying the young player's performance in his mind, hearing every part he had missed the first time. He had judged too quickly, too harshly. And now he didn't know how to step forward and admit it. The young player waited until the next student finished before he left the backstage area. He slipped into the quiet hallway, hoping for a moment alone. The spotlights and crowded stage had drained him, even if he didn't show it. But just as he reached for the back door, someone called his name. He turned. It was the American teacher. The man walked toward him with slow steps, as though unsure if he should approach at all. His usual firm posture seemed softer. That was unexpected, the teacher said when he reached him. The young player didn't respond right away. He simply waited. The teacher continued. You played with something I didn't see in you before. Still no response. Not out of disrespect, but because the young player wasn't sure if the teacher was offering praise, explanation, or another layer of criticism. Finally, the teacher sighed quietly. I misjudged you. The young player blinked, surprised to hear the man say something so direct. You have your own style, the teacher went on. It doesn't match the way I teach, but that doesn't mean it lacks value. I should have realized that sooner. The young player felt a small shift inside him, not forgiveness exactly, but something close to understanding. Thank you, he said softly. The teacher gave a slow nod. Keep playing like that. Not for anyone else. For yourself. Then he stepped aside, giving the young player space. The hallway returned to quiet, but a different kind of quiet. One that felt lighter. The young player walked outside, taking in a deep breath of cool air. The sky was turning gold as the sun began to set. People leaving the hall carried programs and talked excitedly about the performances. Some even recognized him and smiled. He made his way toward his family's car, where his parents waited with expressions filled not with surprise, but with the soft pride of people who had always believed in him long before the applause, long before the stage lights, long before the teacher's change of heart. His mother hugged him tightly the moment he reached them. You were amazing, she whispered. His father placed a hand on his shoulder again, a wordless gesture that always meant more than any speech. They drove home slowly, as if wanting the moment to last. The young player looked out the window, watching the world blur into warm colors. He thought about everything that had led to this day, the frustrations, the doubts, the unexpected conflict with the teacher, the hours of practice, and the feeling of finally being heard. Later that night, he sat at the piano again, not to prepare for anything, not because someone told him to, but because he wanted to. The house was quiet, his parents asleep. He lifted the fallboard gently, his fingers brushing the familiar keys. He began to play a simple melody, soft, steady, and full of the calm he felt now. It wasn't the dramatic performance from the concert. It wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was just for him. But halfway through the piece, he heard a faint knock at the living room doorway. He turned to see his little sister peeking in, sleepy-eyed. You're still up? She asked. I couldn't sleep, he replied with a small smile. She walked in, rubbing her eyes. Can you play the one you played on stage? He hesitated. It's a bit loud for the house right now. She shook her head. You can play it quietly. I just want to hear it again. Her voice carried the pure kind of honesty only a child could offer. So he nodded, adjusted his posture, and began again, softer this time, just enough for the notes to drift gently through the room. His sister sat on the couch, eyes half closed, listening like it was the most comforting sound in the world. The moment felt small, but it touched him more deeply than the applause earlier. Because if music could calm even one person, especially someone he cared about, Then all the practice and effort had been worth it. His sister fell asleep before he finished the piece. He carried her carefully to her room, tucking her in without waking her. When he stepped back into the living room, he noticed his father standing near the hallway, smiling faintly. "You played beautifully today," his father said softly. The young player nodded. "Thank you, and you played beautifully just now, too." Those words meant more than any comment from the audience or the teacher. The next morning, the young player returned to school. The concert had become the main topic of conversation. Students gathered around him, some asking how he learned to play that way, others saying they never knew he had that kind of talent. Teachers who rarely spoke to him offered short compliments. He didn't feel overwhelmed this time. He simply accepted the new attention with quiet humility. Then, unexpectedly, the American teacher approached him again, this time in front of others. "I would like you to consider joining the advanced group," the teacher said. A few students nearby looked surprised. The advanced group was usually limited to those the teacher personally selected and trained closely. But the young player didn't answer immediately. He thought about his style, his individuality, and the way the teacher taught strict, structured, rigid. The opposite of what made him feel connected to music. "I appreciate it," the young player said, "but I think I want to keep learning in my own way." The teacher looked surprised, but not offended. Instead, he nodded with respect. "That's fair," he said. "But if you ever change your mind, the invitation stays open." The young player smiled politely and walked away, feeling more sure of himself than ever. Over the next few days, life returned to its usual rhythm, but something inside him had changed. He felt more confident, not because others finally saw his talent, but because he understood it himself now. One afternoon, while walking home, he passed a small community center. A sign outside read, "Free music sessions for kids. Volunteers welcome." He stopped. He had never thought about teaching before, but the idea sparked something in him. Not teaching the way the American teacher did, not with strict rules or intimidating standards, but teaching in a way that allowed kids to discover music the way he had, gently, naturally, honestly. He stepped inside and spoke to the coordinator. "I'd like to volunteer." He said dot, and that decision opened a new path one. That would shape not only the children he met, but his own future as well. Because music, he realized, wasn't meant to be measured or judged first. It was meant to be shared, and he was finally ready to share it. When the young player began helping at the community center, he didn't know exactly what to expect. He had pictured a quiet room with a small piano, and maybe a few children curious enough to listen. But the first day surprised him in ways he wasn't prepared for. The room was filled with noise and movement. Kids ran around, laughing and playing. Some tried tapping random notes on an old upright piano in the corner. Others sat on the floor with toy instruments, shaking them loudly with no sense of rhythm. It was messy and chaotic, nothing like the quiet and controlled environment of the concert hall. But the young player didn't feel overwhelmed. If anything, he felt something warm settle inside him. This was music too, just in a different form. One of the staff members greeted him. "You're the new volunteer, right? The pianist?" He nodded shyly. The staff member gave him a gentle smile. "The kids will love this. They don't get many chances to learn from someone who actually knows how to play." He didn't know how to react to that. He wasn't used to being spoken about with that kind of faith, but he appreciated the kindness. When the session began, a small group of children gathered around him near the piano. Some looked excited, others distracted, and a few simply curious. He took a breath, sat down on the bench, and placed his hands lightly on the keys. "Do you like music?" he asked them. A few nodded vigorously. One kid raised his hand and asked, "Can you play something fast?" Another shouted, "Play something loud." A smaller child whispered, "Can you play something pretty?" He smiled at all of them. "I'll play something simple first," he said. He began with a short melody, light, gentle, and easy to follow. The kids quieted almost instantly. Their eyes widened as they listened, as if hearing the piano in a new way. When he finished, one of the older kids said, "Can we try?" He nodded, one at a time. "I'll help you." And so he guided each child. He showed them how to place their hands, how to press the keys without slamming them, how to listen to the sound they created. Most played messy, uneven notes. Some giggled the whole time. One child refused to touch the keys at first, then suddenly gained the courage and played a tiny melody of 2 notes. The young player didn't judge any of them. He encouraged each attempt, no matter how small. "This is good. Try again. Gently this time." That sounded beautiful. He realized slowly that the joy on their faces came not from playing perfectly, but from simply being allowed to try. When the session ended, a little girl tugged at his shirt and whispered, "Will you come back next week?" He nodded. Of course. That moment stayed with him the whole evening. Over the next several weeks, he became a regular presence at the community center. Parents began noticing the change in their children. Kids who were once shy or reserved now spoke eagerly about music. Some who struggled to focus in school found calmness when sitting at the piano. Others just enjoyed the noise and the freedom to express themselves. The staff praised him for his patience. But he always shook his head. "I'm just sharing what helped me," he would say. One afternoon, while he was teaching a small group the basics of rhythm, the American teacher unexpectedly appeared at the community center door. The young player froze for a moment, surprised. The teacher looked out of place among the colorful posters, running children, and scattered toys. He stood tall, holding a music folder against his side. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the teacher said. The young player shook his head. "You can come in." The teacher stepped closer and observed the children tapping on small drums and playing simple keyboard patterns. His eyes softened slightly. "You're teaching them well," he said quietly. The young player shrugged. "I'm just helping them enjoy music." The teacher paused, then said, "That's something I sometimes forget." The young player didn't know what to say. The teacher continued, "I wanted to talk to you about your future." The kids around them didn't seem to notice the seriousness of the moment. They kept tapping and laughing. The teacher lowered his voice. "Have you considered pursuing music more seriously? Professionally, I mean." The young player hesitated. The idea had always lived quietly in the back of his mind, but felt too far away to touch. "I don't know," he admitted. "I love music, but I don't know if I'm good enough for something like that." The teacher's expression softened in a way the young player had never seen. "You are," the teacher said firmly. "What you have can't be taught. Your technique can improve. But your expression, your connection to the music, that's rare." The young player looked down at the piano keys. "I don't want to lose the way I play," he said. "You won't," the teacher replied. "If anything, training will give you more ways to express yourself. But only if you choose that path, not because someone expects it." The young player thought about the children sitting nearby, their laughter, their excitement, their genuine love for the small melodies they could create. "I want to keep teaching here," he said softly. "At least for now." The teacher nodded. "Then that's the right choice." There was no disappointment in his voice, only respect. Before leaving, the teacher added, "If you ever decide to take the next step, come find me. I'll help you." The young player nodded. The teacher walked away, leaving behind a quiet sense of possibility. Months passed. The community center's music sessions grew more popular. More kids joined. Donations helped replace the old piano with a better one. The young player found himself teaching not just melodies, but confidence, patience, and the joy of listening got one afternoon. A small boy who had been attending for weeks approached him with a folded piece of paper. "Can you read this?" The boy asked shyly. The young player opened it. Inside was a drawing of a piano and a stick figure seated at it. "That's you," the boy said proudly. "You're my music hero." The young player felt something warm settle deep inside him. Not pride, but a quiet sense of purpose. That night, he sat at his own piano again. He played slowly at first, feeling the familiar comfort. Then he shifted into the melody he performed months earlier, the one that surprised the hall, the one that opened this new chapter. As he played, he thought about the journey from that moment to now. He thought about the American teacher's first harsh judgment, then the change that followed. He thought about the children who learned to trust the piano one key at a time. He thought about his family, their support quiet but strong. He also realized something important. He didn't need the approval of a crowd. He didn't need someone else's style. He didn't need to fit into a strict mold. His music had always been his own, and now it belonged to others, to the kids who learned from him, the parents who saw their children grow, the teachers who recognized his gift, even the American teacher who had learned a lesson from him. When he finished playing, he sat back, hands resting loosely in his lap. The room was quiet, but not empty. It felt full with everything he had gained, everything he had shared, everything still waiting for him in the future. He didn't know where music would take him next. Maybe teaching, maybe performing, maybe something in between. But one thing was certain. He finally believed in himself. And that belief, soft, steady, and honest, was the truest music he had ever created.